All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our next video on evolution, and we're going to be continuing upon our evidence for evolution and looking at evolution from common descent. Let's get started on this next video. So if I were to go into a pond and I were to go through and let's say we are going on an alien world, I'm going to take a microscope and we're going to take a sample from this alien pond. And I'm going through and I see all these little organisms inside this petri dish on my microscope. The question that I'm going to ask myself here is which of these individuals came first and then which other individuals evolved from it? Now if I go through and I look at this picture here, it might seem obvious, but how will we go through and classify this, and how will we go through and show that these individuals were from common descent? So the way I would go through and classify these organisms is via a cladogram. And in a cladogram, what you're essentially doing is taking a diagram and you're going to use your best guess or a hypothesis as to how you think these individuals are related. What we can see is this line that is going up and moving into the right-hand corner of the screen. What's going to represent time? Now let's say I gathered that first individual. I think that individual came first because it is the simplest. I'm going to say the individual with the eye socket came next, then a full-blown eyeball, then the individual with just the nose and the eyeball, then we have an individual with the eye, the nose, and the mouth, and then eventually we see this individual with an antenna here, and they have the antenna, the eye, the nose, and the mouth. Now in this case, this cladogram is really going to represent my best guess of how I think these individuals are related. And I can show that over time, how these individuals went through and evolved based on this diagram here. But it's really based on this hypothesis or guess that I have based on the complex morphology of these made-up creatures. Now, a cladogram is going to be a prediction of how closely related organisms are. So we're looking at a cladogram that's going to end with primates here. We're going to say that, and look at this cladogram and say, well, the hagfish came first. Now, the hagfish came first because it doesn't have jaws, and it's a fish that lived in an aquatic environment. Then what we see is the rise of jaws, and then we see the rise of bony jawed fish. We see the evolution of lungs, so lungs appear in animals, and we get individuals that can now move to terrestrial environments. We see the rise of claws. With the rise of claws, we get individuals that can now climb in terrestrial environments. We have the rise of feathers, which allows animals to go through and fly. And then we have the rise of fur and mammary glands that will go through and allow for, in this case, rodents, the mouse, and then eventually primates to go through and proliferate on the surface of the earth. So if I'm looking at this cladogram here, well, this is going to be a best guess of how I think these organisms are related and how they went through and evolved over time based on their morphology. Now, the other way that we can go through and represent this is with a phylogenetic tree, and this is going to show evolutionary interactions among groups with evidence to support that tree. Now, the key word in here is going to be evidence. If we look at this phylogenetic tree here, we have the first cell. And then we're going to go through and we're going to show time on this axis here. Further on down we are on the tree, this is going to be into the past. And then the further on along we are on the tree, this is going to represent the present. And what we can do is we can draw these arms here. And these arms are going to represent how these species and different types of organisms on the surface of the earth are related. So if I go through and draw this tree here, what I'm actually going to see, well, is fungi are more closely related to animals than they are related to plants. And the size and where these branches are placed shows the relatedness of these organisms here. Now, if we were to go through and draw dinosaurs, well, dinosaurs would go through and draw off at the end of this phylogenetic tree here. And what we would draw is an X at the end of this to show that those species are now extinct. But we can see at the bottom of the tree, we're representing the first cell. And then the length and the distance the branches are from each of these different classifications of organisms indicates how related they are. Now, the word that I used in here was evidence. We are using hard evidence to go through and support this. This could be morphological, but in many cases now, we draw these trees based on DNA evidence. And DNA evidence is going to be very specific and highly accurate to give us the most accurate phylogenetic trees that we can go through and understand the relatedness of organisms. So if we're looking at the difference between these cladograms and these phylogenetic trees, let's look at the difference between the two. A cladogram is going to be a best guess, and it's going to be based on a hypothesis, and it's going to show relatedness based on the shape. We can see cladograms in general are going to have this kind of linear pattern where they go through and they represent time along this axis here. Now, a phylogenetic tree is going to be based on evidence, and the branch distance is proportional to the evolutionary distance that the organisms are apart from each other. So cladogram is based on evidence, but it's really a hypothesis or a guess, whereas a phylogenetic tree is going to be based on hard evidence that allows us to draw this more accurate map. Now, if we're looking at this cladogram of primates here, well, we can represent it like this. We can make a best guess based on morphology, but we can also make a best guess based on where they are geographically located. So what we see here is lemurs, and then lorises, and then we have our tasirs, and then we have our New World monkeys, we have our Old World monkeys, we have our great apes, and then we have humans here. And we can represent this cladogram based on the morphology of how related they are, the geographic location, and then we could put together a phylogenetic tree based on DNA evidence if we went through and collect all the DNA from all of these individual organisms. But as we look through this cladogram here, what we can see is how related these organisms are to each other. Now, there are going to be a couple of rules for phylogenetic trees. Now, the first rule is going to be that life started out as simple and it evolved into the complex form we see today. So we can see organisms like bacteria and different types of fishes that eventually led to the terrestrial organisms that we see today. And we're really thinking about these trees as going from simplest to more complex. This isn't a hard, steadfast rule, but in many cases we can go through and make this generalization. Now, the second thing that we can go through and put in here is all life forms evolved from a single cell. So we have to understand that all life forms originally came from this single first cell. Our third rule is going to be that branches indicate where life forms separated. So when we go through and look at where those branches go through and kind of veer off, well, that's going to indicate where these life forms went through and speciated or separated. The fourth one here is going to be the length of the line, especially when we're talking about phylogenetic trees. And really, this is only applying to phylogenetic trees, is the length of the line represents the time since the types of species have separated. So the length of the line is indicating how long it's been since they went through a speciation event. Our fifth one is the types of species that share a fork are more closely related to the individuals that they share that fork with than to other types of those individuals. And we'll go through and we'll look at an example together to show this. Now, number 6 is going to be the 6 kingdoms are currently represented as living and are at the top. And then the last one, 7, lines that don't reach the top indicate the species type has gone extinct. We'll go through and look back at our example to really fundamentally understand this. All right, so if we're going through and we're looking at this phylogenetic tree, well, what we're going through and representing is how related these organisms are. What we see here are what we call nodes. And our nodes are when our two lines or our two branches on our phylogenetic tree go through and branch off here. And sometimes I say phylogenetic and sometimes I say phylogenic. You can use those words interchangeably. So if we're looking at this diagram here, how am I going through and reading this? Well, here, this is our original and first common ancestor that all of these individuals go through and share here. And every time we see one of these nodes, what we see is a speciation event occurring, or these individuals are branching off and creating a new species. So something occurred at this node here that allowed bacteria and archaea to go through and speciate. Something occurred here that allowed protists and archaea to speciate. Same thing here, protists and plants. And we can represent how related they are, again, based on where they are related and where their nodes go through and connect here, and then how far and how long these branches are. So because fungi and animals go through and share this node here, they are more related because this node is closer to these two individuals here as compared to this node here, right? We can see that this node connects the fungi and the animals, whereas if we wanted to go through and show relatedness between plants and animals, we would have to move further down and further back on our phylogenetic tree. Now, if we go through and see this one here, we can see that this X here is representing that these individuals no longer exist. Dinosaurs have gone extinct. We can show a branch and show how related animals and dinosaurs are, but this X here is showing that these individuals no longer exist on the surface of the Earth. So again, we're trying to go through and use the nodes, the length of the branches, and then go through and read this diagram here to see how related these organisms are. And phylogenetic trees are going to represent how related organisms are based on hard evidence. In a lot of cases, nowadays, that is going to be via DNA evidence. Okay, so now if we're looking at a cladogram here, this is going to be different than a phylogenetic tree. So what we see here is this here, these are where our nodes are. So these are where our nodes are. And remember, nodes are going to indicate an evolutionary change that has caused a speciation event. And what we can see is, if we're looking at this line here, we're seeing that this individual has speciated from whatever individual they're coming from, their common ancestor, because they've gone through, and in this case, they've gained a morphological event such as jaws. So in this case here, these nodes on this cladogram, these are what are going through and representing these speciation events there. Now, the other thing that we have to go through and think about here is, remember, this is representing time as the individuals go through and evolve. So we can look at kind of a guess of their relative relatedness as we go down this cladogram here. So the perch and the hagfish are going to be more related than the finch and the perch are. And we can say that for a variety of different animals. And we can use how far apart these nodes are, and we can kind of look at where these individuals are on this cladogram to go through and look at the relative relatedness. But again, remember, a cladogram is not based on this hard evidence that our phylogenetic trees have. Now, the thing that we really have to understand here is that every living thing on Earth is related to all other living things on Earth. And when I say every living thing, I mean every living thing. And this is what I'm saying, evolution from common descent. We can go through and explore the tree of life to show relatedness among these species, but every living thing on Earth, if we were to draw a big enough tree, is related to every other living thing. And the way that we group these species and share similar traits, we represent on these diagrams here. So when I'm looking at a cladogram and I'm looking at these trees, remember, we follow our 7 steps, and we can go through and use those 7 steps to really go through and understand and read those trees. But remember, we're representing how related organisms are because all organisms came from this first original cell. We can use DNA, morphology, geography, a variety of other things that we will go through and talk about to figure out how related these organisms are and then where those nodes occur on these trees. All right, so did you guys learn? Well, did you learn a couple of things? Did you guys learn about cladograms and phylogenetic trees? Did you guys go through and learn the differences between the two? They are different. It is important to know the differences. And then lastly, did you learn about evolution from common descent and why we're going through and trying to really unwind and unbundle this? This is going to be the end of the video. I will see you guys in class tomorrow.